As a leader, if I tell you abandon OKRs, it feels super scary for so many reasons. Like you've only ever learned that you do management by objectives, you need numbers, targets, etc. And you don't know as a leader, is my team really adept at being able to measure correctly and be that rigorous about measurement if I don't tell them this is the target I want you to hit? So I understand that it's hard to move away as a leader. So what you can do, like one approach is, if you must set OKRs, set them, but start to de-emphasize the key results and start to not focus so much on, is my team hitting this or not?
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us again. Today is actually super, super special to me because we have Radhika with us. Thank you so much for joining us, Radhika.
Thank you for organizing this, Sebastian.
So before we get started, I actually have to tell a little private anecdote how Radhika and me met. So that was last year in October, I believe. And we were both speaking at this conference in Romania called Pro. And I think we already met like during the rehearsal of the speakers, which was a lot of fun. So there were basically like 10 people in the room. It was already a lot of fun. And then there was this cocktail reception that we had in the evenings. And we were just like standing at this table and pretty much talking about like everything product. And it was so much fun. That's why I'm super delighted that Radhika is here today and can join us.
Likewise, that was one of the best conferences, and it was really because of all the people that we met there, like including you, and other people that there were speakers there. It felt like authentic connections, right? It was just really wonderful.
Absolutely. And if by any chance you don't know Radhika yet, which is impossible to be honest, but like in case you haven't met her yet, so Radhika is the author of a book called Radical Product Thinking. And first of all, brilliant book. If you haven't ordered it yet, like go to Amazon right now and just like order the book and then read it, and then you can thank me later and Radhika, of course. But the reason why we're actually here today is to talk about a new book you are currently writing, which is, and I'm not like spoiling it because you can explain it way better than I can, which is in like the rough outline is basically rethinking metrics and how we use them, right?
Exactly. So I'll share a little bit about why this book even came about. So, one experience that I've had for years and years now is I find that companies are goal-oriented. They set up OKRs. It's all about setting targets and saying, okay, as a product team, you have to hit XYZ targets for these different metrics, or as a company, we have to hit these different metrics. And what I've found is, right, whenever you have targets, metrics tend to get corrupted. And there are like 3 or 4 common phenomena that I keep seeing. So the first one is sandbagging, right? I was observing OKRs being set up in an organization at the beginning of the year. And, all these leaders were negotiating OKRs. And finally, like one leader gets up and goes like, okay, guys, I cannot sign up my team for failure by committing to these OKRs, right? And no matter how ambitious you are, it feels like you're committing to, it's like you're setting a final exam for yourself, and you don't want to fail that final exam, right? So even for the most ambitious people, you feel like when you have a target, it's a failure if you don't hit that target. And I know people say, oh, you're not supposed to achieve your OKRs. They're supposed to be aspirational, etc. But it's not grounded in science at all. This is not how it actually works. This is not how people actually feel. Like, people are not okay with getting, like, especially ambitious people, they're not okay with getting anything less than an A grade, right? Or an A plus, right? Another common thing that I see is...
Can I ask something before we dive into the next thing? So I mean, so saying, okay, they should be aspirational. Isn't this also like a cultural thing in terms of company culture, or would you say otherwise?
It's the book Measure What Matters, written by John Doerr, that about OKRs, that actually says this, that, oh, they're supposed to be aspirational. You're not supposed to ever hit that OKR, right? Like if you get to 80%, that's supposed to be great. It's nice to say all that you're not expected to hit it. The reality is that's not how people actually feel. That's not how psychology works. So I don't know that it's about company culture. I think leaders then read such books and such statements by famous billionaires and then feel like this is what they're supposed to do. But it's not grounded in science or psychology.
So is it once again this, all right, it worked this one time and then we are kind of adapting it? So is it the Spotify squad model again?
Exactly.
Okay.
It is like the Spotify model that even Spotify doesn't use, right? By the way, in fact, Spotify used to do individual OKRs and they dropped that, right? It's just an interesting tidbit. But going back to this, right? The whole premise that OKRs brought success to Google and, the Bill Gates Foundation and blah, blah, and all of them attributing success to OKRs. It's kind of like saying, Steve Jobs was successful because he wore a black turtleneck. It's like he was successful and he could have worn whatever the hell he chose, right? It's not that black turtleneck made him successful. So it's kind of like that about OKRs.
Got it. So what you're essentially saying is like, all right, these organizations would have been successful because of their principles, because of their culture, because of the people that work there, had nothing to do with OKRs. I mean, this is again like the kind of the discussion about like, should you adopt these frameworks? Is it more important to use the frameworks or to apply to these principles, right?
Right, exactly. I think what happens is you have people with a lot of authority and fame who have been successful. It's like, John Doerr is kind of like the Midas of Silicon Valley. When he says this is what you should do, it carries authority. And so we listen to that. But we haven't necessarily looked at it scientifically and said, okay, do OKRs actually work? And throughout my career, I've seen issues. And what's interesting is that there have also been research papers. Like there's a really famous paper called Goals Gone Wild. And it talks about how goal setting actually is detrimental to companies. And despite, by the way, what's funny is even John Doerr in the book, Measure What Matters, he talks about this really well-known paper that talks about the issues with goal setting. And he dismisses it, saying, if you just set OKRs right, then you overcome these issues, right? And this is the thing, like every time anyone says, well, OKRs aren't working for me, people go like, oh, then you're just doing them wrong, right? And this is why I felt like there was a need for a book to really talk about what are the issues with OKRs. And so I talked about sandbagging as the first one. Shall I go on to the next one?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe one last.
Yeah.
Because I'm actually super interested because I mean we also have people coming to us and saying like OKRs don't work. There's companies that I've seen for them it worked like fairly okay. So the question, I mean, obviously it's not only about OKRs, right? So OKRs is just like the framework that everybody wants to adopt right now, right? It's more about how should you set goals instead, right? So this is, or like, how should we set goals? So this as like a more like a broader question.
To me, it's more about how do we use metrics? Because when you set goals or targets, right? Let's talk about real examples. Like, let's say you set a target of get 20,000 signups by the end of the year. So what happens when you set such a goal? Teams are all working to prove that, look, I hit that number that you set for me, because nobody wants to fail, right? So I'm going to work as hard as I can to show you I've hit 20,000 signups. What do you want instead as a leader? You really want to figure out the fundamentals of your business. Like if you're a startup and you're trying to get all these signups, you need to figure out, is my message resonating with personas that I'm targeting? Am I targeting the right personas? And like, what is working, what is not working in terms of marketing, right? I need my team to experiment and solve this puzzle. So what research papers show is when you have a puzzle and there is no single obvious strategy that works, goal setting actually gets in the way of progress, that you're less successful in solving those puzzles compared to a do your best instruction versus 20,000 signups by end of the year. And so if I go back to this model of goals versus metrics, right? The whole point is don't set targets, but metrics are super important. You should be measuring, like you should be figuring out, what is working, what is not, which personas am I targeting, how do I figure out if my message is resonating for those personas or not, what are the right sales channels, and like what marketing message do I try on these different sales channels, how do I optimize for my whole conversion funnel starting at the top, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff to be measured, but what you don't want, which is when you have targets, is you don't want a corruption of metrics where people are just trying to show you, ta-da, look, I achieved what you told me to. And if it's just 20,000 signups, I can game the system. I'm smart. I'll I'll just include all the bot signups. I'll include whatever crap I need to, right? Like whether or not it's the right personas, but that's not what you want from your team.
Okay, so understood. So you should have metrics in place. You should measure. So you made this one clear, right? So it's not about not measuring. It's just that sometimes goal setting in the situations that you described in the example get in the way. All right. Then for sandbagging. So sorry, I'm just like, so the reason, I mean, the thing is, the reason why we do these events, because they're interesting for us, right? So hopefully also to the people who are watching and listening. But yeah, that's why I'm asking all these questions, because it's like super interesting for me. And obviously I also don't have, I don't really have a set opinion in this case. I just find it like super interesting to get a different perspective on goal setting and metrics.
And it is such a different perspective, right? So I really appreciate all of your insightful questions, because it really is a different mindset. And here's a really interesting thing that I discovered just literally in the last week. So hot off the press, like here's why we think differently when we don't use targets. I was talking to a colleague, an ex-colleague of mine who I had coffee with, and I hadn't seen him in like more than 10 years, right? And so we started talking, and we connected because he read one of my posts on LinkedIn and about instead of using OKRs, using OHLs, or objectives, hypotheses, and learnings, and it really resonated. So he said, let's get together. So we had coffee, and he was telling me how in 2020 he had a stroke, and it affected the left side of his brain. And one thing that he realized is that it shifted how he thought about product or how he was looking at metrics. That initially he was really focused on the analytics and the numbers and just, and this is what happens when you set targets. It's always about, am I hitting this 20,000 signups or not? This is kind of the one metric. It makes you very focused on that one task of 20,000 signups, right? And what he said was, after the stroke, he started using more of different parts of his brain where it was more about the narrative and the strategy. And so instead of focusing on just numbers and the metric, it was more about the story of what are these metrics telling you? And this hit me because, when I work with product teams, sometimes I literally had this last week where I was talking to a product manager, and she was telling me about weekly active users. And I said, okay, forget the number of weekly active users for a moment. Tell me, what are these people doing on the app? And walk me through exactly what you're learning from all the analytics and the metrics. Tell me the story. And then as she started telling me the story, there was a whole picture that came together, a story, right? And from that story, I was able to say, okay, now that you've learned this, if I gave you a magic wand, what would you ask for in terms of a new landing page for mobile? And like it led to her answering the questions, is it working? Then, what have we learned? And then finally, what are we going to do differently next time, right? This is what I want out of teams. On the other hand, when you have OKRs, what happens is you're just focused on the task at hand. I have to hit 20,000 signups or get X number of weekly active users. And that's like the focus. And it leads to the loss of this narrative. You're not using this part of your brain where you're really learning, what exactly am I? What's the story behind the metrics? What are they telling me?
Okay, understood. So it's also so basically the criticism is also like in that direction, that you focus too much on like the absolute numbers instead of focusing on the qualitative insights that you can generate through like keeping like the results a little more open. But isn't that also, like, being the devil's advocate here for a moment, isn't that also something you could incentivize by coming back to what you said earlier, setting the OKRs right?
So the setting the OKRs right, like, and this is an example that, I was talking to Tammy Rice, who is a product coach, and she was sharing from her own experience. She was working at a company where they, instead of setting a target, right, they set the goal of, I want you to figure out this puzzle of figuring out the conversion funnel. And she described to me like how giving the team this puzzle of figuring out the conversion funnel led to a very different approach in terms of experimentation, right? If you said get 20,000 signups, what you'd focus on is a certain part of the funnel. So if I say, get this conversion funnel, figure out the puzzle of this conversion funnel, show me that, but is that the right sort of OKR? Like, typically OKRs are supposed to be measurable, a target that you hit. They're numbers that are supposed to be something that, like John Doerr describes it as, you can ask in a binary way, have you or haven't you achieved this? And that's the problem, where it leads to less experimentation, and it leads to focusing on things that limits what the team is going to work on. I'll give you an example. There was an OKR that John Doerr describes in his book as an example of how this is amazing. It was an OKR from the Bill Gates Foundation about malaria. And the objective was eradicate malaria. And some of the key results was show that drug-based approaches are effective in eradicating malaria. Well, how well did this work? This is according to John Doerr, what is a good OKR, right? What actually happened in reality, and there have been, someone who is heading up malaria research within the WHO actually said that it created a cartel of malaria scientists who were pushing for one approach, a drug-based approach. Why? Because that was the OKR. What if instead, you ask the puzzle question of like, okay, how do we solve this problem? That leads to better solutions that are more practical, not just drug-based. Even the objectives sometimes, right? Sometimes as leaders, we decide that we know this is the right thing to solve. Even this example of malaria, right? Bill Gates Foundation decided that this is the problem that needs to be solved in the developing world. And there was a publication, an article on Lancet, a well-known, medical journal, that said, in a lot of the developing countries, malaria is a very small percentage of what causes deaths. Like, there are a ton of other diseases, like including just, gastrointestinal issues, even, road deaths because of traffic accidents that need to be solved. Like, those are higher percentage of, causes of mortality compared to malaria. But as a leader, you've decided this is the puzzle that we have to solve. And so this is where, instead of an OKRs approach, where leaders decide this is what we do, this is the solution, go for it, we need a more open approach, which is, as a leader, we figure out what are the puzzles that we need to solve. Involve your team in figuring out what are those puzzles, and then use a hypothesis and learnings-based approach. And that is what I talk about in the book, like what we need to do instead of OKRs.
Got it. So I have lost track a bit here. So we were with the sandbagging, right? So that's where we started.
Those were the issues with,
those
right,
were the
OKRs.
issues. So those are the issues with OKRs. So to wrap that up, so there's, and you have to help me with that. So there's sandbagging, basically the issue.
Yeah.
Oh, you go ahead.
So there's sandbagging, which is like, yes, that even ambitious people need to feel like they need to set easier goals. The second is it focuses you on very specific tasks as opposed to looking more broadly. So a lot of people describe it as, I feel like I'm constrained to just work on those things. The third thing is, it leads to very often teams working on outdated goals. So basically, if you look at large organizations, when you're setting OKRs, you negotiate OKRs across, cross-functional teams, right? And so you do that once in a year. And once you've set those goals, you're kind of stuck with them. And, this is where OKR experts go like, oh, you just need to set them every quarter. So you just do it more often. And I heard an executive respond to that going like, we would die if we had to set these goals multiple times a year and negotiate those. And so I would much rather be stuck with, goals that have been set, and they may be wrong, but like we would die if we had to take the other approach of resetting them regularly. And then one last problem is this issue, which I talked about, is how do I frame these metrics for management? This is the corruption of metrics that I was talking about. How do I show management that this is working, as opposed to genuinely questioning, is this working? What have I learned? What are we going to do differently?
Okay, got it. So, I mean, that's quite a handful, right? So, and let's see if you get mail after the event. Because I know there's like a lot of people out there that are trying to adopt OKRs. I'm also not gonna lie, it's like you are not the only person out there, and also not the only person I have talked to that is basically claiming that we as a community are either using OKRs wrong or should be doing something else instead. So yeah, would be super interesting to see what kind of feedback we get after the episode. Okay, so now we have like all these issues, and you already hinted a solution with OHLs, but can we maybe get like a little deeper into it? So if you would like walk me through what we should do instead. So instead of these quarterly OKR planning thingies, the objectives being set by management, the key results being set by the teams, like basically cascading into the overall company objectives. So what should we do instead?
Yeah. The approach that I advocate for is, as a team, we are a lot more motivated in solving puzzles together and feeling like, we're making progress in solving this puzzle. So as leadership, we have to start by defining problem statements and leading questions, right? So let's look at what these problem statements might look like. Here's one. So our customer services organization is not self-sufficient enough. Every time a customer call comes in, they have to go to engineering. And so our engineering team gets pulled into a ton of issues. So you can say that as a problem statement. And so instead of setting targets and goals like, okay, reduce customer service calls to engineering by 50%, like what is that going to do? That's just going to mean that the customer service team is going to feel like they can't reach out to engineering, but that's only going to mean that, the customer suffers, right? Or issues take longer to get resolved. Or like things go underground, just don't record things, just go to engineering, and so on, right? So what do you do instead? So describe this problem statement, and instead of setting key results, You then set leading questions like, okay, is this because our customer service team needs more training? Or is it because our product is not stable enough in the field? Is it because our product maybe is too complicated and we need more logging and self-service tools for customer service to be able to do the self-service and figure out what's wrong? Like, set a bunch of questions. And now you've given this puzzle to your team. And so as a team, right, you can work with leadership and set an objective. Like, this is what we want to solve for. We want engineering to be able to not constantly be pulled into customer service calls. And so if that's the objective, right, in terms of hypotheses, you can write a few hypotheses that you believe are the key problems. And then the learnings is where you go and figure out, is this hypothesis working? So one hypothesis might be, okay, if we create logging tools for customer service, they'll be able to do self-service and not pull in engineering because they have access to figuring out what's wrong. Now that's a hypothesis. And you're basically describing, if we do this experiment, this is what I expect as an outcome, because this is the connection. And now the next step is learnings. You go work on logging and you try to see, have we made this hypothesis any better? Then you might discover the next step. Okay, the team is doing a ton of logging or is able to access all the logs. It just turns out to be a really shitty product in the field that has so many issues that, they're overwhelmed. And so then you have the next set of hypotheses and learnings, right? And so what we want is a system where we are describing objectives, hypotheses, and we're talking about learnings really openly between the teams that are doing the execution and with leadership. And we discover what's working, what's not, and what are we going to do differently together next. So that's the kind of collaborative learning we want to have happening through OHLs. And at that point, it's like saying, I don't need to set a target to see if this is working or not. It's the communication and constant feedback loops that make you realize, yes, we've solved the puzzle or we've not solved it, right?
What I find interesting in that regard is, how do you do expectation management in these scenarios when you do OHLs? Because, at the end of the day with OKRs, there's always, let's say, a certain expectation to it, right? Even if it's kind of like a stretch goal or should be, let's be fair, not all organizations are doing it that way. Like some say we set realistic goals and not very ambitious goals, right? But how do you manage expectations when you simply define a problem statement? You come up with a couple of hypotheses that you iterate on and share the learnings. But it's all, at the end of the day, I get that it's all in the communication, right? But how would you expect this expectation management to be done, especially towards top management? Because at the end of the day, they are not in the trenches every day, right? And they expect certain results. And with OKRs, it's really easy to set a goal saying, get X from A to B, right? And here it's more like, okay, we have a problem, like you described, like in customer service, and now we come up with a couple of hypotheses how we might tackle this problem, and then we share the learnings. But it's not really telling us anything about, okay, how good do we think this is going to get, right?
Yeah, but see, herein lies the assumption that when you set these targets and goals, yes, it feels easy as a leader to set that target and a goal, right? But the assumption is this is what the team needs, that you already know what is the right number, right? If you don't, so I'll give you the example. Going back to that 20,000 signups, when you set that number at the beginning, you don't know, is 20,000 the right number? Is 1 million the right number? Like, where in the middle is, what is the right number? So you set some arbitrary number and the team is supposed to hit that, right? Which is why you get all of this gaming. The point is, it feels easier to do management by objectives. This is what we've learned all along in business school, that you do management by objectives. But the reality is, if whatever number you set, you're going to discover that it's either right or wrong, or you need to adjust along the way. OKRs just prevent or make that adjustment much harder. What you really want is the open conversations where leaders continue to give feedback. You might go off and try to solve this puzzle with customer service and trying to include logging. And as a leader, I might be able to tell you, look, this is not working. I need you to work faster, or this is the solution you've come up with, adding all of this logging. Yes, but how customer service has to access these logs is a bunch of bullshit. It requires so much training. It's not practical. Do something better. This sort of feedback needs to come as feedback. It's not going to happen because of goals or just setting targets. I could set a target, okay, go give logs to customer service, but I need to give you feedback if you've done it in a shitty way that is so half-assed that it's not going to actually help the team. So it's more about communication. It feels easy as a leader to think that if I just set a target, I'm setting you off on a mission. But it's kind of like the casino, where how they say the house always wins. I feel like the product team always has the metrics. The product team always wins. You can show whatever stats you want to show. That famous statement also, lies, and statistics. I can show data to show whatever you want me to show. The reality is, you don't want me to just show bullshit. You really want me to solve a puzzle. And that's what you want to incentive or motivate me towards, right? You want to motivate me to solve puzzles.
I mean, that's completely fair. I'm just wondering, at the end of the day, yes, setting a goal and setting a random number, I still feel like sometimes, hopefully that number is not too random. Hopefully you have seen in former experiments that you were able to increase a number. For instance, let's take the signups again, that marketing is running a huge campaign next quarter, and you are not only looking at the sign-up rates, but hopefully also how well qualified the signups are, all these kind of things. And I get it that you can basically fake or basically try to bend every metric by doing certain things, right? But still, in practice, does this really work for or let me phrase it the other way around. How do you need to sell it, in big quotations, to top management? Because at the end of the day, it's also, all these things are always a budgeting discussion, right? So for how long, how much budget do we get to work on this problem? For how long can we keep working on this problem, and how well is kind of good enough? I guess that's kind of where I'm going. And this is not clearly defined in the beginning when you do OHLs, right?
But it's not defined in OKRs either, right? Because you say, this is what I need. You say, go solve this customer service problem. You might set whatever OKR, deliver tracking or logging for the team. And okay, so I show you that I've done it. I've met my OKR. But what then, right? So this is this point that you bring up, that don't you need to have such benchmarks anyway? The budget question, the question of how much time, all of that, you have to talk about anyway. You have to give feedback to the team. What I see with OKRs is that it reduces experimentation and increases postmortems. I'll give you an example, right? The same example of weekly active users. I was working, so at this company that, I was talking about with the weekly active users, they had OKRs for get X percentage increase in weekly active users. It wasn't, it was a very realistic goal. I hadn't, if you look at it as an OKR, there's nothing you can say is wrong with that, right? But what I was actually observing teams doing is they were so focused on the weekly active users metric that I wasn't seeing the sort of experimentation and narrative, right? It was all about, I have to show that we're getting this number of weekly active users. So it was, how can I do more promotion of the app? Like, we need to get more people to start using it. It was all focused on that. If you ask very different questions, like you're saying, okay, forget the number for a second, just talk to me about what is working. I want that experimentation. I want people to figure out, what have we learned and what are we going to do differently? That's actually those two questions, right? Or three questions. Is it working? What have we learned? What are we going to do differently? Those are the essential questions for innovation. And those questions get skirted when you have OKRs. When you have OKRs, I just want to show you what's working. I want to show you a high number for weekly active users. My goal is to show you good numbers, and I'm going to hide the bad numbers. Whereas the reality is, you want your team to show you the bad numbers and say what's not working. And when you can talk about what's not working, you as a leader have more leverage to be able to say, okay, I understand what's not working. You get to have more granularity in sharing. Am I going to give you more budget to solve that problem? Or is this not worth it for me? Right? You have more information to make guided decisions, as opposed to things being swept under the rug. I might be spending a lot on solving this weekly active users problem. If I discover that the problem is so fundamental, maybe it's not worth spending money on that app at all, right? If it turns out like our personas don't use a mobile app, like this is a B2B thing where they only use the desktop, this is their mindset because they're not tech savvy, whatever it is, right? When you are getting people to show you good and bad numbers, true learnings, then you can truly make the right decisions, as opposed to what you say you want and people will just show you that they've achieved what you want.
Got it. Understood. It's actually quite interesting because we, like 2 years ago, I think 2 years ago, we had a talk on our conference by Anya, someone who used to work at Tinder, and she actually talked about how they started doing experiments that were basically going toward qualitative insights again, because they were getting stuck in A/B testing. So because they were just focusing on the numbers, they were not really sure anymore whether they were actually optimizing in local maxima. And to me, it feels a bit like your approach is also going in that direction. So basically widening your horizon to basically figure out, is this really the right thing to solve, or could we solve it some other way, other than being completely narrowly focused on metrics? But
I love what you just said, right? Like, let's even algorithmically, there's a term for this in algorithms, right? When you know something is down this path, you do a depth first search. When you don't know that it's down that path, you do a breadth first search. And what happens in OKRs is we're making teams do a depth first search, and you don't always know. As a leader, you're assuming that this is where the answer lies, and that's the malaria example that I gave, right? Whereas sometimes what you really, not sometimes, like generally what is preferable is, this is the puzzle I need you to solve, so it's a breadth first search.
Got it. So if people are listening and they think, wow, that sounds great, but I have no idea how to get started. So how do you start kind of getting that into a company, even maybe like an experiment, if they are, for instance, currently working with OKRs, or they might not, but like, how do you get started implementing or like experimenting with it in a company?
Yeah, I love this question, right? Because as a leader, if I tell you abandon OKRs, it feels super scary for so many reasons. Like, you've only ever learned that you do management by objectives, you need numbers, targets, etc. And you don't know as a leader, is my team really adept at being able to measure correctly and be that rigorous about measurement if I don't tell them this is the target I want you to hit? So I understand that it's hard to move away as a leader. So what you can do, like one approach is, if you must set OKRs, set them, but start to de-emphasize the key results and start to not focus so much on, is my team hitting this or not? Stop doing the scoring of teams or individuals, etc., against those key results, because that'll get you the behavior of just doing postmortems that we didn't hit the weekly active users, but it won't get you learnings, right? So that's the first step. What you want to encourage is collaborative learning and open discussions. So as a leader, you start to de-emphasize, and what you insist your team does instead is share with you their plans for experimentation, hypotheses, and learnings. And then what you need is not just leaders making this change, but you need the individual contributors and teams as well to adopt a slightly different way of thinking. Like, instead of just using numbers to prove that you've achieved something, you really need to genuinely question, is this working? What have we learned? And what are we going to do differently? And so as a team, like, being able to ask this question of yourself, to say, what is my hypothesis? And then what are some leading and lagging indicators? The leading indicators are the ones that you can tell quickly, where, if so sales, for example, is a lagging indicator. If you get sales or revenue, you don't know kind of what exactly attributed to it, right? Whereas, maybe for a conversion funnel, if someone is like more people clicking on something or moving to that next step, those are leading indicators. So think about leading and lagging indicators. And then secondly, don't just stop there, because if you only focus on, I've picked out these few metrics, then you're again going to be super task focused. Think a little bit more broadly, questioning, what are the metrics telling me? Try to weave a whole story around the metrics. And that leads to sort of broader, more creative thinking. And then finally, you ask this question of, what are we going to do differently? If I had a magic wand, what would I do? And so this is how you can bring it into the organization, right? It's both leaders deciding that they want more experimentation, realizing that they don't have the answers to everything. It's not a depth-first search. It's puzzles that need to be solved. And then individual contributors and product teams saying, we're going to measure extensively and rigorously, but it's more towards this approach of what's working, what's not, what have we learned, and what are we going to do differently?
So what I'm basically hearing is that you could also try this with one team, start this. So basically as an experimentation to see how this is going, because at the end of the day, like, big change is also always super scary. And also I would think that after maybe years of fight, some people have managed to convince their organization to adapt OKRs to finally become outcome-based. And then now it's basically a different thing they should try. So what I'm hearing is you could also start doing it on a team level. You could also start doing it in an OKR setup just to get started and try this out, whether this actually yields better results.
I so agree with you. And, even as a team, even if you're doing this at a grassroots level, maybe your leadership doesn't know about OHLs, but you just want less soul-sucking work. You just want to feel like you're really making a difference. Within your team, just start to use this OHLs approach. Think about it as a puzzle, hypotheses and learnings, right? Because one thing that happens in goal-driven organizations is that this muscle of figuring out puzzles and saying what's working, what's not, what are we going to do differently, what have we learned, like, that muscle has atrophied a little bit because we're just very task focused on those 20,000 signups, or like get logging to customer service or something like that. And so just even within your team, just at a grassroots level, start to first get really good at this, and then you can communicate upwards to leadership saying, these are the hypotheses and this is what we learned and this is what we're going to do differently. you can take that approach at a grassroots level as well to be able to bring about change and start to create momentum. And even if you don't share it, you'll just feel happier within your little bubble by actually learning together as a team.
Radhika, thank you so much for sharing this. That was definitely interesting and probably also a little bit thought-provoking, because for the past, I feel 3-4 years, I've only been intensively talking about OKRs, and now I have a feeling I will need to look into OHLs as well. So thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all of these insightful questions. Something you just said, if I can add one more thing, is, you said about now I'm going to have to start looking at OHLs. I feel like I can hear this pain that now it's a new methodology. I think of it more like a mindset, right? Like this muscle that's so important to build anyway. So it's not so much a methodology, more like a mindset of experimentation, of asking questions and then figuring out learnings. So maybe I'd like to frame it as this is kind of the most natural way of working, and that we're sort of bringing this back into an environment that has lost this natural way of working. But thank you so much for these insightful questions, Sebastian. It really made me kind of also frame it slightly differently at the end of this, right?
Brilliant. And I mean, now, so make sure to put all your questions into the chat, because we have two things now. So we actually have a little announcement that I'm super happy about. And then also you want to know how you can get featured in the book. So let me start with the little announcement first. So Radhika is coming to Munich on the 9th and 10th of October. Wow, I'm really in, like, the thing is really in the way now, but like I can do it like this. So the great news is that Radhika is going to give a talk at the actually a keynote at the Just Product conference this year, which is on the 10th of October. But she is also going to give a workshop, the Radical Product Thinking workshop in Munich. So in case you want to join, you can simply scan the QR code, and until I think end of March, you can get 100 euros off the original price. So definitely make use of that. And then the reason why everybody is here right now, tell us a little bit about how you can get featured in the book.
So, in this time when I'm writing the book, I really want this to be a community effort. I want people from around the world to share how you've applied the OHL approach, and then feature you as a case study in this, and as you transform from OKRs to OHLs. So if you want to be featured in the book, scan this QR code. And it's a form where you can tell me a little bit about yourself and kind of what resonated for you. And I'm creating a program where with a hand-picked group of amazing people from around the world, you're going to join these meetings just once a month, just so that, as you apply this hypothesis and learnings approach, you can also hear insights from these other, brilliant individuals. You can get both mentored and you can mentor others through your learnings. So we'll do that every month. And then, at the end of this program, at the end of 2025, I'm going to have written up a case study based on, all of your learnings, the insights that you've shared, and feature you in the book. And so you'll be a featured case study when the published book comes out in 2026. So I'm really looking forward to working with you. And so, feel free to share if you would like to be part of this.
That sounds like a fantastic opportunity. So make sure to scan this QR code right here. And
I should probably also share kind of what kinds of organizations or people I'm looking for in the case studies.
Right.
In terms of organizations, really, it's any size, all the way from startups to large companies. I like this variety. And in terms of the kind of people who would be part of this cohort, it's really three types. One, and feel free to, add something that I've not thought of here. One is leaders who want to transform their organization from a goal-driven approach to OHLs. The second is individual contributors or product people who want to do this more from a grassroots level, where you want to bring this way of thinking into the organization. And the third is whether you're a leader or an individual contributor, but you don't feel like you can change the goal-driven approach in your company. So you still feel like the company itself is going to be goal-driven, but you want to create this bubble within and use OHLs for yourself. So those are the three categories, and feel free to share in the form. There's the option of other, if there's another interesting category that I haven't thought of.
Great. And it also seems that I got the QR code wrong. So in case you were wondering why you got to the workshop page, I have to say we just did this last minute, but I also posted the link to the form into the chat. So make sure, so if you find something like this in the chat, make sure to click this instead of scanning the code. But if you have scanned the code, make sure to sign up for the workshop. That's also like a great way of working with Radhika. All right. So should we also take one or two questions from
I would
the
love
audience?
that.
Brilliant. Then let me take one. So shouldn't this change of mindset and perspective mean inherently that companies would need to review their way of strategy setting, managing products, and funding projects? We need to think in new terminologies or redefine them. For example, what is a persona? What is a sales cycle, etc.?
Oh, such a good question. I feel like these are questions that we have to be answering as organizations anyway, right? But you're right that very often this doesn't happen in organizations. Like there's an organization that I've been working with, and in terms of product, I'm bringing in this whole way of thinking about OHLs. But if you look at their sales cycle, I don't know, for example, if the sales team is tracking these questions about, our personas. Are we hitting the right persona? Do we have the right message for the right persona? What is our sales cycle? Why is our sales cycle so long? What have we learned? Like, you're absolutely right that as an organization, we need to apply these ideas across the organization, right? And this is why I feel like we have to start somewhere. And as a leader, rather than just stating targets, like we have to set puzzles, even for the sales team, like figure out, why is our sales cycle taking 300 days? We don't do that. We set a target saying, okay, ARR of blah million by the end of this year. And that's what we drive our teams towards. So I completely agree. We do need to bring in this way of thinking, and this is a healthy and important set of things that we should be talking about at the company anyway.
Got it. So I have one from John. Controversial, I guess, but aren't OHLs an additional top-down layer, but one that loses the outcome focus?
I actually don't want this to be another layer at all. Like, this is really what you want in an innovative organization, where they're constant. This is the scientific method, isn't it? After all, like, we constantly focus on what is working, what's not, what have we learned, what are we going to do differently. I don't know why this loses the outcome focus, right? I think this goes back to the leadership mindset that by setting by setting targets for you, I'm telling you this is the outcome I want. Well, just because you told me that as a leader, that this is the outcome you want, and you're going to give me, a C if I don't get that outcome and an A if I get that outcome, doesn't mean you're going to get actually what you want. I might either get a C because I'm being honest about the metrics I actually achieved, or I might get an A by gaming my metrics, right? But it doesn't guarantee that you're going to get the outcomes just because you set a target. What you instead want is experimentation. Your curbing the ability for your team to fail intelligently. So there's a book that came out recently, Right Kind of Wrong, by Amy Edmondson, the same woman who wrote about psychological safety. She was the person who coined the term, right? And she talks about the need to fail intelligently. When you set targets, you're making failures go underground, because you're making everyone prove that, look, I've succeeded, I get that A. What you want is the ability for teams to fail intelligently, learn from failures, talk about failures and learn from them, and then say, okay, what am I going to do differently?
Thank you so much, Radhika. Maybe the last question from Lawrence. Will you be delivering workshops in 2025 in the US?
Oh, I had, I will be. There is a link on my website on radicalproduct.com. There's a link where you can say, you can express interest in certifications, radical product thinking certifications, and I'm planning on doing online certifications and running these workshops online. So if you sign up for that and express interest, I will email you when I'm planning the next online workshop. And the next time I'm at a conference in the US, I will be doing workshops. I'll also send info to my mailing list. So please feel free to sign up on the mailing list on radicalproduct.com.
Brilliant. And in any case, Lawrence, come to Munich in October. I know it might be a bit of a stretch, but hopefully, or like I know at least, definitely worth your time. So
I am so looking forward to Munich, by the way. It is going to be an amazing conference. And for those of you who haven't seen Sebastian talk, he is a music rock star who brings that sort of energy to keynotes as well and talks. So I'm really going to enjoy this conference in Munich, and we're going to have so much fun at this workshop in person. In-person workshops are so much fun.
Yeah, definitely. Oh my God. That was lovely. Thank you so much for this. And yeah, so hopefully everybody that watched this has signed up on the form that I posted into the chat. If not, please look for it, the Google Docs one, sign up, and then make use that you can actually talk to Radhika once a month, which is completely for free, right?
Yes.
And you get featured in a book. I mean, that's a no-brainer, isn't it? That's an absolute no-brainer. Okay, thank you so much, everybody, for watching. And if you have any further questions, contact me or Radhika on LinkedIn. If you have any thoughts or wishes who we should have next on the show, definitely get in touch with me on LinkedIn. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it for today. Thanks again for joining us, and hopefully see you all very soon.
Thank you. See you.